Oh. So you're like a lady.
I just thought it was
So you get that credential from the SSA too? So rather than and then you sit for the exam and everything?
Yeah, this is the one for me. Yeah. You got it now?
But he's working at the LSW.
Yeah, that's like the biggest one, right?
2 years, having all of my hours.
Okay.
That's what I always wanted to do.
Oh, okay. So I worked for Catholic Charities for a while. And so I worked with lots of people who had various requests.
I had some classmates that was there.
Yeah. It's a huge organization in Chicago.
Just like our land.
Yeah.
I worked for Texas.
Are you muted again? Am I? I think, I understand what you're
You're
saying.
live streaming now.
Oh.
So you might want to mute it.
Okay. Great.
Everybody knows you're live.
Thank you so much for having me now. Thank
But
you.
don't forget to unmute
Yeah, but
it.
I will. Okay.
Listening to you now. So yeah, before going to shelters or over somewhere, asylum seekers, survivors. Even before, I was always at Harvard. I was in the RICS, the refugee resettlement.
Yeah, so I volunteered with the refugee resettlement program when I was settling in England, because they speak Swahili. Yeah, I worked in Tanzania for a handful of years for volunteering. So, yeah. Yeah, yeah, and my dissertation was all in Africa. I'm looking at Somali refugees. Kind of going back to history.
Yeah, I was thinking about going to do some work in the future. Yeah. Really struck by what they did after the genocide. Learning was in terms of modalities, psychological.
Yeah, you know the other place in East Africa with a lot of work that's psychosocial work is Uganda. In northern Uganda with you know, there's very, very large child soldier population.
So they were working with that.
Yeah, and that's just a place where I know like a lot of
Peut-être serait-il si vous vous installiez en bas.
Oui,
Ça,
après,
vous voilà. Oui, tout à fait.
Everybody gets his house. Dan?
Yes.
It's that YouTube.
I can send it to you.
Okay, yeah, and then I said like,
Yeah.
Let me just add to the consumption.
wait, just.
Hello, testing, 1, 2, 3. This is a test for our Marianne Midwest partners. Please adjust your sound. I believe
I got it
all
down
the sound
to that.
is
I'm a
coming
Harvard
through
grad.
fine. So test, test, 1, 2, 3. Test, test, 1, 2, 3.
So it's a similar kind of setup. Well, you never know. I mean, in a day's time, the world could change. In which case, you will have new things to say. Oh.
So if anyone says a bad word, you can edit that.
It's like, you know, what the news now does entirely, right? Like this is, yeah. So, you know, that's how things get actually run the organization. If you had been in the upper month, the 10,000 you and you had a do you think that your organization could mobilize and respond to that? Yes. I was pretty confident.
But the fact is that if you take such a position, OFPRA is not
Yeah.
I can act if the Ministry for Home Affairs does what I because they would decide about the access to the so on my side I'm ready to do it. But the government
So you think like your institution with experiments with autonomy has just been an
it was a fact.
So it's interesting because a lot of but it's been relegated in the Department of Justice. And so the oversight of the whole system is more it allows for more political manipulation. And this is sort of, this has happened with the constant
Je promets donc Pascal Brice qui est attaché de presse.
Chers collègues, vous voyez comme je parle je me tiendrai à cette déclaration-là devant
Ça va, vous allez bien? Yes.
Legislation, also like our department. I know. It's not so the Department of Justice, and there's this legislation some years before they had allowed the department to internalize some of the policies. And so that has happened in the Department of Justice. So you're probably entirely. And that's in fact where like the United States number of they're all with the Office of and such significant bureaucratic
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. My name is Dan Birchie. I'm the Administrative Director of the France Chicago Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening to a lecture on an important and timely topic delivered by a most distinguished guest speaker. And since this lecture is part of the Marianne Midwest series, this welcome extends both to everyone here in this room and also those of you joining us virtually as you gather in universities, Alliance Française locations in Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Missouri, Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, and Michigan. So, bienvenue à tous. Immediately following the lecture, we will transition to Q&A style discussion here to my left. And the discussion will be moderated by Ross Camarena, a postdoctoral fellow at the Harris School of Public Policy, who's affiliated with the Pearson Institute, and whose work focuses on the political economy of migration and conflict. During the Q&A, we'll be taking questions both from you here in the audience, and also from those of you who are joining us virtually. The questions from those here in the room, you should raise your hand. The moderator will acknowledge you and give you the floor. Look for a microphone to be passed to you, and then deliver your question into the microphone, and really about 2 or 3 inches from the microphone, so here, not here. Those of you asking questions in remote locations, you'll submit your questions via the internet, and our moderator will integrate those questions into the discussion. So I also want to acknowledge the valuable contributions of the many organizations whose financial, logistic, and intellectual support has made this event possible. The France Chicago Center, the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflicts, the Harris School of Public Policy, the Franke Institute for the Humanities, the Cultural Services of the Consulate of France in Chicago, the University of Chicago Law School International Programs and International Human Rights Clinic, the Posen Family Center for Human Rights, the School of Social Service Administration, and the members of our Marianne Midwest network. Introducing our speaker tonight is Soraya G. D'Oliveira, an alumna of the School of Social Service Administration and a recipient of a France Chicago Center summer internship travel grant, which, not so very long ago, supported her work in various nonprofit organizations addressing the refugee situation in Paris, in Calais, in France, and in Europe. So, Soraya, welcome.
Good evening, everybody. In the summer of 2017, I have the pleasure to work in the north side of Paris, more precisely at the Porte de la Chapelle metro station. While there, I was struck by the large number of men and women seeking asylum in France. And back to Chicago in the same year, I was preparing my research for my final capstone presentation at SSA, the School of Social Work Administration, and I used a lot of data that I found at generated by the French Office for the Protection of Refugees and Stateless Persons, OFPRA, the organization that our guest speaker, Mr. Brice, directs. I might also mention that after making all the research, I came with a profound sense of respect and appreciation for the important work that they do. So last month, they asked me to introduce Mr. Brice, and I was beyond happy to do so. So Mr. Brice has a long list of accomplishments and a long journey until here, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to convey in 3 minutes that they gave me, because it's a long list, but I'll try. So Mr. Brice, Pascal Brice graduated from the Paris Institute of Political Studies, Sciences Po, and the National School of Administration. Before being the Director-General of OFPRA, he was a diplomat working as a chief secretary for the French embassy in Morocco. He also served as a writer at the Subdirectorate for Foreign Relations and International Affairs of the European Community within the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. He worked as a diplomat advisor to the Ministry of Agriculture in France, to the Minister of Economy and Finance, and to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Also, last but not least, Mr. Brice was the Consul General of Barcelona. I think I did it. I hope I accomplished. So please join me and welcome the Director-General of OFPRA, Pascal Brice.
Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour. I'm very glad to be here with you tonight in Chicago, in the Midwest, to share some reflections, some thoughts about this struggle for asylum in France, in Europe, and beyond. I've been the head of the French Agency for Refugees, OFPRA, since 6 years. During this period of time called European crisis, about migrants, asylum seekers, or refugees. I can tell you something you already know. Those are hard times for asylum seekers and refugees. Not easy times, neither in France, neither in Europe, neither in other parts of the world. I do believe that they are part of a crisis which goes far beyond than them. It's like if they were a catalyst of a huger crisis. Again, in Europe especially, but not only in Europe. So I'm very pleased to share with you some thoughts, some reflections. Again, I won't give you lessons. In French, giving lessons is something I'm sure about something. I did everything so well that I can tell you what you can do. That's not the reality here. I just want to share some experience during those 6 years, some convictions, because they are something I'm rather sure about, but not completely sure, because we are talking about exile, about European beings, about women, men, women, children, on those terrible roads of migration and exile for asylum. If we have a short look at figures, and try to describe the situation in Europe now and during those past 4 or 5 or 6 years. What we can notice is that we had in Europe, between 2014 and 2016, an important increase of asylum requests in Europe, especially in Germany. It raised still more than 1 million of people seeking for asylum in Europe in 2015, 2016. But then it's decreasing. And that's something rather strange, to see that we have now an important political crisis in Europe at the moment which the arrival in Europe have been decreasing. This year, in France, we will have something like 120,000 asylum demands, requests, rather the same level as in Germany. It means that after a short period of time in which Germany has been a very, very important country for welcoming refugees, and I want here again to say my huge admiration for what the German people and government has been doing during this period of time. I was there in September 2015 in Germany to welcome some refugees in France, and what I have seen from the German society, I will never forget it. But now we're back to a longer trend, which is that France is the first country for asylum in Europe, and rather at the same level now than Germany. I've been looking at the figures in the US, and not surprisingly, asylum seekers in the US is something, a reality which is rather marginal compared to the whole migration in your country. Asylum seekers are something like 200,000 people, including resettlement programs, which has been a long and important tradition in the United States for many years. It's something important, but it's marginal compared to the whole migration that can exist in the United States. Let's come to the thoughts and reflections after those 6 years in this European crisis in Europe, France, and in
what's happening in our societies. I would like to share 4 main points with you tonight in this struggle for asylum. The first one, and I would like to underline that, is that if we want to win this battle, this struggle for asylum, we have to be lucid. We have to be clear about what's happening in our societies. I mean, in France, in Europe, and maybe in other countries. If you want to be efficient, if we want to win this struggle, we cannot be blind. We cannot live in a theoretical world. To make refugee welcoming live, be preserved and growing, we have to be very clear and lucid about the situation. I would like to raise 2 points about that. First, we cannot afford to lose this struggle. We cannot. Because asylum is about something which is part of the deeper thing we have as human beings. We're talking about protecting people who've been going away from their country because of persecutions, because of their political commitment and beliefs, because of their religious beliefs, because of their ethnic belongings, because of their sexual orientation, because they're going away from terrible wars in Syria or Afghanistan. So it's about our ability in France, in Europe, and other countries to say we as human beings it's our duty to welcome those people. It's in the deepest of our history. You know that, for example, the French Revolution has been built on that. France welcomes those who are freedom fighters and fight against tyranny. But it's not only French, it's very American too. It's European, it's the very core of our common values. This is the first point. It's something we cannot lose. And there is a real and very important risk at that time in Europe, but not only in Europe, that I want to underline. Facing this difficulty to manage asylum in the context I will come back to, a rather difficult social, cultural context. And speaking about Europe, because as you know, Europe is a federation too. But above all, in this field of asylum and migrations, the federation is much weaker than yours here. So it's a challenge for Europe, for member states, to build a capacity to protect asylum in Europe. And when it's difficult, like it has been during those past years, there is a risk, there is a temptation, there is a trend, which is called outsourcing or externalization of asylum. This temptation to say in Europe, but not only in Europe, I think I can see that it's partly in this country, saying there are safe third countries, abroad Europe, who could deal with that. We don't need to have asylum seekers in Europe. We can transfer this responsibility to countries which are abroad, south of the Mediterranean Sea. And in Europe nowadays, you have people who now say that. They say the dream is a Europe without asylum seekers. It would be a nightmare. And this is a temptation we have to fight against. But for that, we have to build an alternative, and I will come back to that. This alternative does exist, and especially the French president is trying, and we are trying in OFPRA, to build this alternative to externalization, to outsourcing. To be lucid, to be clear about what we are facing, we first, as I told you, have to be completely conscious of what is at stake. But at the same time, we have to face the reality of what is happening in our societies, in France, in Europe, and maybe in the United States. We have society there where you have both enthusiasm, people who want to welcome refugees. And I see that in France, everywhere. But at the same time, you have people who have fears, social fears, cultural fears, fears about their identity. And there's something rather strong in Europe, because at the same time in this globalization, we are building this common European identity. And we see growing the nationalism all over the world, not only in Europe, not only in North America, but for example in Brazil, where the question of migration has been rather present too in the last political campaign. We have to face this. We cannot be blind. I try not to be blind. I cannot say to people who have fears about what they are, what their social situation is, about employment, about their identity, about their culture, there's no problem. We have to welcome as many people as necessary. Doesn't matter. No. If you do that, it's counterproductive. I do believe that we have to take this into account, including one very specific and complicated aspect, on which I want to be very precise, which is the terrorist threat. Asylum seekers are victims of the terrorists. I can tell you this because in OFPRA, in Paris, we are having interviews with people coming from those countries. They are victims of terrorists. But we have to face the reality, and we know it in France. We had attacks in Paris in November 2015, including from 3 persons who arrived with migrants from Turkey and Greece. That's the reality, and people have this in mind. It's completely marginal, but it's a reality. We have to protect asylum from this threat. But the answer is not to close. If you close, the terrorists win. That's what they want to do. That they want us to do. We have to build, and that's what we are doing, systems to make sure that no terrorist can enter in the system of asylum, can be protected. And it's the Geneva Convention. You know that in the Geneva Convention, you have the exclusion clause, which makes so that people who have been torturing, killing, who are authors of crimes against humanity, terrorists, must not be protected under the refugee status. So that's part of the reality we have to face, doing it to protect asylum in our countries. That was the first kind of thoughts that I would like to share with you. Then, to be able to win this struggle for asylum, the second thought I would like to share with you is that we must protect asylum as such, in its specificity. In the whole world and the whole reality of migrations, there is a specificity of asylum. But asylum is not enough to solve the question of migration. I'm telling you that because I've been hearing very many times during those 6 years as head of OFPRA saying, "Oh, that's awful. You are doing a selection. You are doing triage. There are the good migrants, the refugees, and the bad migrants, the economic migrants." I tried to be again lucid about that. I know that some people had this in mind. Some people would like to do, we will be perfect on asylum, but we don't want any economic migrants. I'm not blind, I know that. But I want to underline something which is in my mind very important. Which is that, again, asylum is specific. Asylum is an historical, a sentimental, a legal, a constitutional system which is apart. I call it a treasure. It's our treasure. It's a French treasure. It's a European treasure. It's an American treasure. I would say it's above all the treasure by countries who welcome much more than we do, American, European, French, refugees. Lebanon, Turkey, Kenya, Chad, Asia. Let's not forget that. Those who welcome most refugees in the world are not the Western world. Those countries. Anyway, asylum is specific. It's a specific treasury. We must defend it as such, which means that we must respect the key principle of asylum, which is first, every foreigner must be able to access to the procedure to seek for asylum. Then to be accommodated, welcomed in good conditions. Then to have a good quality of examination of its request. Then to be integrated as refugee when refugee status is recognized. Or to go back to the country if the person is not recognized as refugee or doesn't have any other kind of title for residency. We have to respect and to protect this. What is the key problem we are facing during those not only 6-10 years, during those past decades in Europe, and maybe the same kind of thing in the United States? Asylum is a victim, a collateral victim of the closure of migration policies. I'll give you an image. It's a corridor, a terrible corridor, in which migrants are. There were lights for legal migrations and asylum. Most of those lights for legal migration have been turned off during those past decades. I don't say it's good or bad. Maybe was it a necessity? I don't know. But the fact is that at the end of the story, the only light which remains is asylum. That's why, for example, in France, OFPRA, if you take this year 120,000 people seeking for asylum in France in the year, we will protect something like 40% under the Geneva Convention and the subsidiary protection, which is something which is true about asylum in the European law, but we will refuse 60%, which we can call globally economic migrants. Because again, the only light which is there is asylum. And you have people now saying, it's a problem, we have to turn this light off too. Again, we cannot afford that, but we have to be completely clear about the fact that, again, asylum is separated from migration policies. It must be separated. But asylum is a victim of the lack of regulation of migration policies. That's why I do believe that first we have to defend and to make grow asylum policies in France, in Europe, and everywhere else. We still have much to do, especially in France. We've done rather much, but there is very much more to do, and especially in Europe. I would like to use another image, another picture. I would say that the rules we should have at the national, European, international levels about asylum and migrations is something like a house in which you would have a first floor. The first floor, the first tier would be asylum. Asylum has a specific legal system. And you have to do everything to be 100% in the compliance of asylum. But it's not enough. It's not enough because you have people who are in some situations and there are needs which are not in this first part of the house. You have to add another floor, a second one, which I would call humanitarian law. For people who are in a very difficult human situation, but who are not in the criteria of the status of refugee. I give you one example. We have many people in France coming from Western Africa, seeking for asylum in Western Africa. They don't have fears in their country, but they have been destroyed in Libya, tortured, kidnapped, raped. This is not asylum, but they should be protected. So we should build something, and it's the same kind of reflection we should have, I guess, about climate change displaced. That's the second floor. And then the third floor is about legal economic migration, that we should build too. And then the roof, the end of the story. The people who must not stay, must not stay. Because if not, we feed the confusion that exists in many people's mind, which is that we do not respect the law, neither for asylum, neither to protect, neither to say, when you're in a country, there can be a debate about that. But in a country, you have the right to choose who stays and who doesn't stay. But you need for that fair rules, transparent rules, and rules which are compliant. And I do believe that it's a very important challenge we are facing. I would like to add another point on this aspect of the specificity of asylum. I do believe that asylum is much about politics. As you can say, much of what I've been telling since the beginning is about political choices. The protection of borders, the financial means for accommodation, the determination of the fundamental rules. This is politics. And we need politics to build this house I was talking about with those rules. But there is a limit to that. The limit to that is the moment in which the status determination authority, such as OFPRA, the authority which decides if you have to recognize or not the status for refugee to someone, this is not politics. This is legal affair. That's why in France, OFPRA is an independent body. In the French law, you can read, OFPRA doesn't receive any kind of instruction in its attributions. Because we just apply asylum laws. Migration policies, migration debate, migration choices is not my problem. The diplomatic consequences of my decisions, of my team's decisions, when we protect a refugee from a country, are not our problem. And it mustn't be our problem. I tell you that because it's not the case in all countries. In Europe, for example, we have colleagues of OFPRA and other European member states which have the same kind of status. Others don't. And sometimes it can be problematic. I would like to come to a third point, a third reflections I would like to share with you tonight. I do believe that if we want to succeed to preserve and make refugees welcome growing in France, Europe, and everything and elsewhere, we have to do this on an organized way, a managed way. I see that, and I saw that so many times in France and in Europe. When you see the spectacle of the disorder, for example, people arriving in Greece in 2015 with any kind of control, this is the worst situation for what people have in mind to welcome refugees. But when the situations are managed, are controlled, then you succeed in welcoming refugees and welcoming more refugees. I give you one example. You've been talking about Calais. You know that Calais is this little nice town in France, close to the UK. Very close to the UK. Some say too close to the UK. And it was very funny when I've been reading with my daughter Le Comte de Monte Cristo. There is a sentence about this. Someone was going to the UK and say, I will go through Calais because it's the closer place to the UK. So it's an old story. Calais is a very, in my mind, a very precise example of this. The reason why there were migrants in Calais is that they wanted to go to the UK and the UK didn't want to welcome them. If not, you don't have Calais. If people can go to the UK, there is no Calais. The reason why you have Calais, you have people here, migrants, you had people, migrants there, is that because they wanted to the UK for many reasons, and the UK didn't want to welcome them, neither let them possibility for asylum seekers to apply for asylum. At the end of 2016, there were 6,000 people, migrants in Calais, in a slump. This situation, this camp, this slump, has been the worst thing for those people, but for the mere idea of welcoming refugees in a country. Because the idea that the image people have of refugees, of asylum, is that it's violence. Because I will tell you, during the 6 years I've been going to many, many camps in Europe, in Africa, in Middle East. I will tell you something. The camps, the refugee camps, is not brotherhood. Is not the new society with brotherhood. It's violence, it's smugglers, it's women raped, it's children raped. So this kind of situation, this slump in Calais was the worst situation, the spectacle of the disorder. At this period of time, we decided to make so that in 2 years, 10,000 people, asylum seekers, went away from the slump of Calais, went to accommodation centers all over France, and have been seeking for asylum. And I've been going to those accommodation centers all around France, including where, at the very beginning, people were a little afraid. Because I'm not surprised that people can be afraid when they see arriving people in their village, in their suburb, people they don't know, people they relate to the images of violence they see on TV in the camps. They can be worried. Why not? I'm not talking about politicians who use this situation. I say that I'm not surprised that people can have questions about that. In many, many villages in France and towns, at the very beginning, where those people arrived, there had been sometimes difficult meetings for the mayors with the population. When you came back 3 months later, in the same places, the mayors had been doing their job, the French administration had been their job, the charities were there, the social workers were there. No more problem. I was, for example, some days ago in a little village in Alsace, in the east of France. It was exactly the situation. In that case, those were refugees that OFPRA had been interviewed in Niger and Chad. At the very beginning, the mayor told me he had a very tough public meeting with the people of the village because they were worrying about what were those people. There was in those people an old man. He was very tough against the refugees. He didn't want them to come. Now he comes to the accommodation center to give sweets to the children. And they call him Papy Carambar. The carambar is a sweet we have in France. We give to the children. It's Papy Carambar. Because it's organized. Because you have social workers, you have the mayor, you have the administration, you have the charities, you have the people from the village who come to help. Then it works. We need to succeed in welcoming refugees. We need order. We need to organize. We need to have this under control. It means that nobody should be in camps. Nobody should be in streets. Everybody should be accommodated. Everybody should be able to access to the procedure for asylum, to have a fair procedure for asylum. And then the consequences are there. Integration and integration policies for those who are protected as refugees, and those who don't have the right to stay shouldn't stay. I would like to add something about that. If we want to succeed, in this, in the way we welcome refugees, I think we shouldn't let only Home Affairs or Interior Ministries deal with that. It's mainly the case in many countries, especially in Europe. And I think it's a mistake. Because those policies, those asylum policies, those integration policies, many of you may know that working in that field, it's about Home and Interior Affairs talking about residency. But it's about accommodation. It's about social care. It's about culture. It's about language. So in the field of those policies, we need this diversity of expertise, of legitimacy, of approaches, and we must share this. If not, we have policies which are poor, which are not able to deal with the different aspects of how do you welcome refugees in this context we are facing. That you have to deal with local authorities, you have to deal with charities, you have to deal with social workers, you have to deal with teachers, you have to deal with young students. It's a whole energy, the whole public policies energies, the whole energies of the civil society which have to be mobilized to succeed in that field. I would like to end more briefly on the fourth kind of reflections, which are more European, about the way we could deal with this situation in Europe so that Europe could be able to manage what it has not really been able to manage during those past years. And the fact is that the solutions are there. If you take the conclusions of the European Council of June 2018, and mainly thanks to the French president, you have there the keys, in my mind, to build this European policy for asylum we need in Europe. And I do believe we could share with other countries. First, we should develop the kind of thing OFPRA has been doing during 4 years in Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, Egypt for Syrian refugees, and for 1 year, Niger and Chad for African refugees, which is resettlement. We should, as European and with other countries, develop on a much larger scale what we do to protect people as refugees and resettle them in Europe and in other countries such as Canada or other countries. The second point is that, because you cannot only do those operations, missions in third countries, if not, you are in the framework of outsourcing. You have to build something which makes so that when people arrive in Europe, seek for asylum, you have to respect their right, not to tell them, go back to Turkey, or to go back to another country. That's why the idea would be to have in the European member states, at the external borders, in the harbors especially, centers to apply for asylum. And that's what OFPRA did during the past summer when I sent teams in Spain, in Italy, in Malta, so that when the people who had been at sea, rescued at sea by boats, when they arrive, they can seek for asylum there. OFPRA is there, the other European agencies are there. If they are refugees, they are welcomed in Europe. If not, they have to go back. The other point, of course, is that we have to build much stronger policy for integration of refugees. Because I've been talking very much, because that's the main point now in Europe, about how do you accede to the procedure. But there is too another very important topic about what are the policies you put into place for people who are refugees in the field of training, of languages, of employment, of health, housing, common values. And as you know, in France, we have a specific view of what are our common values, so for us it's very important. But I can understand that this can be very French. I have to assume it. But we have to do more about those policies, including at a European level. And then we have to build a European OFPRA. We love so much OFPRA that we like it to be European. A European Agency for Asylum, with a mutual recognition between the national OFPRA and at the end, a European Agency for Asylum, which would be independent as much as OFPRA is from the political bodies. As you see, I do believe that we are facing hard times for asylum seekers and refugees. It's something we cannot lose. We cannot fail. We have been succeeding in some aspects. And I guess that I won't give you any lessons. I try to share with you some reflections, but I have a little idea after the 6 years of what works and what doesn't work. Dignity works. Respecting human dignity works. It's the main point to have order. We must respect laws. We must respect asylum laws and build more regulation on migration. And we must do this on a very organized way, at the national, European, international level. If we do that, and there is much to do, I guess we will have done good thing for asylum and much beyond. Thank you very much.
For all of your thoughts thus far on asylum. I thought what I would do is ask a question of my own first, and then we would take a few questions from the floor. So I was kind of interested in, as you think about building this house with these 3 levels, how do you think the timing of that should work? Because if we think about building a house as a foundation, one thing has to be sure before we can build the other thing. And yet all of these forces are pushing on countries at the same time. And so
You're absolutely right. I guess the answer must not be the same in France, in other European countries, and maybe in the United States. One friend of mine told to me, for example, no, it's not one house with 3 floors, it's 3 houses. Many possibilities. The fact is that at this stage in France, the sequence is, the chronology of this is first building the first floor, asylum. First, you build asylum. You make this grow. You make 100% asylum, and there is much to do already. First, because again, I see that in France, there are many debates about migration. On asylum, less. At this stage, there are debates, but there is something in everybody's mind which makes that asylum, people who've been persecuted in their countries, we all have to protect this. So let's use this consensus, which is fragile, so that we build still more on that. And then we add the other levels. The idea could be, but really I am not sure about that. And it's more, I think, a political debate, taking into account especially the stake of the political debate in each country. But I do believe that maybe we should do that. First, build the first floor, then the others. But I will tell you. I will tell you my example. Not in the sense that example to make the same as I did, but the illustration. As I told you, I've been the head of the OFPRA, French Agency for Asylum, for 6 years. during the 3 or 4 first years, when I was in public debates and I had questions about migration policies, I was always saying, I don't want to answer. I don't want to answer because my task and my belief and my conviction is that asylum must be separated from migration policy. So I don't want to enter in the debate about migrations. Then I was coming back home and my wife was telling me, it's too easy. It's too easy. You cannot be the good guys about asylum and make so the other aspects didn't exist. So I resisted during 4 years. But then my wife is very convincing. And many things happened. For example, this summer, as I told you, we went with OFPRA in Italy, Spain, and Malta to protect refugees who were on boats, on ships, who had been rescued at sea by the Aquarius, if you remember that, maybe this name of the ship. In Malta, it was in August, we went there with my teams, we made the interviews, and we protected 50 people. It was the French number of people we had to protect. And at the very time that I was ready to go away back to Paris, some young man called me in the accommodation centers. They were the last floor, another house. And they wanted to talk to me. And I went to speak with them. They were from Ivory Coast. They speak French better than I do. We could have been in the same school. And they told me, we want to go to France. And the reality is that on the cultural ground, for example, it would be more easier for us to go to France than the people from Sudan or Eritrea, the 50 that we had been protecting under asylum rules. So I touched, as we say in France, very directly this difficulty, which means that I do say again that asylum has to be protected in its specificity. Don't mix. When you mix asylum with migration policies, you kill asylum and you kill everything. But it's not enough. We have to build the other parts, the other roof of the house. In which time, this is more a political debate, I guess.
Should we take some questions from the floor then?
Hello, I want to ask about Calais. It's amazing if you say that many of the people have been resettled in the accommodation centers. I know that there's still a population of refugees or other migrants in Calais, and they are still lacking in like basic sanitation, water, and food. And I also, so that some charities have stepped in. I also know that police in the town have been taking away blankets and like tents and things from the people who are still there. What do you think is the responsibility of the government toward those people, specifically refugees, since that's your expertise, if the government has responsibility still for the people remaining in Calais?
Thank you very much. It's still a matter of preoccupation for me. That's why I still go to Calais to see my friends in the charities I've been working with very much during those 3 years. The situation is different compared to what we've been facing still 1 or 2 years ago. Now you have something like 500 people, migrants, there in Calais, when at that time you had 6,000 or 10,000 people. So it's not the same scale. It doesn't mean that the situation is not a preoccupation for me, because especially you have young men coming from Eritrea, from Ethiopia, and I'm very worried for them. So I do believe there is still much to do. I want to say again, to recall, which is very key. If the UK welcomed those people, there would be no problem in Calais. I'm sorry, but I say that I did the job for my British colleagues during 3 years. I went to Calais each week with my teams to convince people. Can you imagine that? In the US, you have a civil servant who go to say to someone, to convince people to seek for asylum, to convince them. You can imagine how French people can have seen that. What's that? They want to seek for asylum in France, they do it. If not, why do we have to tell them to do it? But we had to do it, why? Because they were there to go to the UK. Because they were convinced, they had families sometimes, they were convinced that the UK was an El Dorado, which is surely true. So I first went to Calais in June 2014. First time. I went there, at that period of time there were only 500 people there. I went there to talk with them. They were from Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, Syria. And I asked them why there were no asylum demand in Calais at that time. I asked them, why don't you? First, they had never thought about that. And they told me, we want to go to the UK. So I told them, you cannot go. If you go, you will face the police, French police and British police, and maybe you will be killed when you will try to go in the, not by the police, but trying to jump in the train. And we've been working with the charities so that, again, 10,000 people accepted to go away and to seek for asylum. So there is still a problem there, but it has nothing to see with what we've been facing. But I don't change. I say that even if it's only 500, they have the right to seek for asylum. So I won't let that down.
In the purple here. Hi, thank you very much. My name is Andrea, and I have 2 questions actually, but I promise I'll be brief. One of the things that you mentioned is that you have a preoccupation about how we should improve policies on local integration. A lot of these policies are developed in the central level of the government, but a lot of them are also developed in the local level of the government. When you take into consideration what you also mentioned, that we have a lot of nationalist governments taking power in the world, and cities are more and more playing an important role in actually sometimes protecting their migrants and their asylum seekers from the central government. You see sanctuary cities here in the US and in other countries as well. I wanted to ask you, what do you think and how those OFPRA sees the really the work of local governments and how we can I don't know, maybe improve that or foster that kind of thing. And the second question is, with the adoption of the global compacts that are coming in the next few weeks, how do you see that impacting the system in France and in the world?
Thank you very much. You're not the first one to ask me about the role of local authorities in these policies. Since I'm in Chicago, I'm not surprised about that. And I understand very well why it's important. I must tell you that, as I can see in France, the role of local authorities is absolutely key. I would say mainly because for a very basic thing that I did see many times. When you talk about migrants, asylum seekers, or refugees with people, the further they are from this reality, the more reluctant they are. The closer they are, when it's organized, the more positive they are. So that's one reason why the role of the local authorities is very important. Because there you can build something that one reason why I'm so fond of asylum policies is not because it's my job. It's because I do believe that we have there something about citizenship. Citizenship. It's very important. For me, it's a kind of laboratory of the new citizenship. I see it like that in France. And it's very important to do that at the local level. I see that in many cities in France. I often speak with that with the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, who is very keen on that. There is another mayor, for example, of Nantes, which is the nicest city in France. It's my city, so it's a good opportunity. Thank you to tell you that. The same. They are doing very much about that because of, you know that better than I do, everything which is about housing, which is about cultural intermediation, training, employment, taking mental cares, which is very important for anxiety people. It must happen at a local, stage. The Germans do that much better than we do in France, for a reason that you may know. France is a very centralized country. Germany is a very decentralized country, and they succeed very much on that. It's a real example of that. Having said so, the fact is that, and I see that with the mayors I talked with about all that in France, they cannot solve everything. They need the national level or the European level for us to do its duty. If not, it's very complicated for them. And sometimes it's still more complicated because sometimes we are in a system which is completely silly, which is so that when you have a national system which doesn't know what it has to do, and which is in a cultural way, which is something I see sometimes in some countries, which is deterrence. Deterrence?
Mm-hmm.
Dissuasion?
Yeah.
Deterrence.
Detroit.
You know, it's my worst enemy. My worst enemy is something that exists in some people's mind, which is that we are going to make so people are not welcome in good conditions so that they won't come. This has existed in every country, you know? It's my worst enemy because first, on the ground of human dignity, it's understandable, but it's inefficient. Who can believe that someone who has been away from terrible things in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Sudan, or in West Africa will be afraid by bad conditions in France or in Europe or somewhere else? Doesn't work. The only effect of that is you provoke disorder. You provoke reject in the people's mind. So the problem is that when you have this, when you have local mayors who do their best, it's very hard for them to manage because then people come here. And they don't always have the means to do that. So there are some countries in which, if I understand well, local authorities have to do because the national level doesn't do. The good system is the system in which everybody does its duty. And again, local authorities are key in my mind. About the Global Compact, it's beginning this kind of irrational political debate. If you see this project in the United Nations, it's a very nice text. It's not compulsory. I'm a diplomat, so I know this kind of things. It's not compulsory. So when you see that some member states are very strong, including in Europe, against this, it's their sovereignty and freedom. But I'm a little surprised about the importance of all this. In my mind, we need, at the multilateral level, this kind of regulations I was talking about. Because again, we need to organize all this. So I'm a little surprised, such as with Arbor, if I understood well, of the impact of all this in the political debate. But the problem is that this is the kind of political debate we have in many countries about that. So that's why, again, I'd like to come back to easy things. Don't mix asylum and migrations. Build a house. Work on that. You are researchers, students, there's much to do. Build a new humanitarian law. Build something will make us able to welcome, as we will have to, climate change displaced. Easy things. Then the Global Compact, we will see what happens.
So we should take some questions from the community afar. So there's questions in Minneapolis and at Truman State, specifically about the U.S.-Mexican border and the migrants who are approaching the United States and the kind of response of the United States. And so to paraphrase, they're wondering whether these, the kind of response we've seen on TV with tear gas, et cetera, is something that you view as in accordance with the Geneva Convention, or how it should be properly handled? Or maybe more properly, if it were France, how would your office handle this?
Well, as I told you, I'm a diplomat. So, and I do respect very fundamentally the national sovereignty, so I won't comment too much about that. What I can say is that there are scenes that you can see, for example, at the external border of the European Union, which are not always so different. So I wouldn't give, again, lessons about that. So I would say that on the general grounds, when such things happen, it's a failure. I say globally. For anybody who does that, it's a failure. It means that you didn't do what you should have to do. Let's not be naive. I'm not naive. You know, the smugglers, I know them. I've been threatened by some of them in some camps. I know what they are able to do. So I'm not naive. But we have to regulate this kind of situation. And above all, we have to respect asylum. If people want to seek for asylum, they have to be able to do it. That's what I would say.
Another question from the floor? You're back.
Hi, thank you for being here. My question is about how asylum sits in a larger policy landscape. I've worked with asylum seekers and refugees and people who may have been considered economic migrants in the US, in Europe, in Southeast Asia. And I saw that during the process of trying to figure out if they were eligible for asylum, or even during the process of waiting for their papers to be processed, they struggled with housing or how to protect themselves if they were a victim of a crime. And so I'm wondering how the landscape of politics to protect people, regardless of if they've achieved that asylum status, what that conversation looks like, and how we can move that conversation to a place of more complexity.
I'm not completely sure to have understood your question, but sometimes my English, especially with the jet lag, is a little...
I speak kind of fast.
Would you say that again?
I'm thinking about people who are applying for asylum,
Yeah.
or they think they may be eligible for asylum, but they don't know. They can't work until they get asylum. They can't always protect their status while they're waiting. They can't access housing maybe, so.
Okay, I understand, excuse me.
Thank you.
The fact is that it depends of the countries. As you know, including in Europe, in some countries, asylum seekers can work, in others they cannot. In France, till 1989, the asylum seekers were able to work. Since then, they cannot. I don't know in the US how it works. I don't know, they cannot work, so it's like in France. So, that's why in my mind, we need to have short delay in the procedure. That's one response. Short and adapted delays, as you know, and in OFPRA we work that way. There are people for whom you need more delays of procedures. For example, people who have been persecuted because of their sexual orientation. Women who've been persecuted as women. For example, I have in mind young women from Nigeria who are in sexual exploitation, or people who have been destroyed by torture. There are people with whom we take time. We need time. We have to take time. But globally, we have to have short delays. First, because it's our duty, but two, because meanwhile they cannot work. It means too that during this period of time, and I think that's what you were saying too, they have to be in good conditions, which is not always the case. In France, at this stage, I think like 70% of asylum seekers are accommodated. It means that 30% are not accommodated, which is not compatible with the law. So it means that during this period of time, everybody has to be accommodated. in good conditions with short delays of procedure from OFPRA. That's why we've been reducing very much our delays. 2 years ago in OFPRA it was 8-month average. The whole procedure 2 years average. Now OFPRA 3 months, all procedure 1 year average. I must tell you, and it doesn't make me so popular with my friends in the charities, in the French charities. I do share many points of view with them, but not on that. So I maybe, shall I be not so popular with you? I think there is a logic. The fact that people cannot work. If tomorrow we decide to make them work, I will be the happiest man in the world. Huh? But there is a kind of logic to say, when you seek for asylum, you have, it's a temporary residence. It's a temporary residence. At the end, if you're protected as a refugee, you stay. If you're not protected by refugee by OFPRA or by the court in appeal, 2 solutions. Or you have another status for residency, or you have to go back to your country. So, if you let people work during the period of time in which they are asylum seekers, I don't see the coherence of the signal you give. Again, it's not my culture. I think you understand that my personal culture would say everybody has to work and so on, everybody can come. But I try to be lucid and clear about what's happening. So my answer, my response is short delays of procedure and good conditions meanwhile. And there is still much to do on both.
The gentleman over here.
I'm John, and I work with LGBT asylum seekers. I'm from Nigeria.
Yeah.
And like today I had a young man who came to my house and we had to prepare a letter of support for him. And each time I think I meet people like that, I think about their home country. I'm gay, and I know what it means to be gay in Nigeria, which has made me stay here all these years. What would you suggest to the United Nations? And how can they really influence the thinking of those countries that are creating unnecessary hostility that keep driving people to seek asylum? Am I clear?
You are, of course. Thank you. I thank you for this question, because I must tell you that protecting homosexual, lesbians, or transgenders for OFPRA is one of the more noble things we have to do. I give you one example. When we were, I told you in September 2015, we were in Munich, when many people, refugees were, asylum seekers were arriving in Germany to welcome 1,000 refugees in France. And there was we were in a place in Munich with thousands of asylum seekers. And we were saying to those people, if you want, you could come in France. And there was a man, he was coming with in the meetings we had with 10, 11 people, coming, going away, coming back. I didn't know why. And at one moment when I was alone, he came to me and he said to me, do you protect people like me? I was, what do you mean? I mean, I'm homosexual, and I told him, we are here for you. Having said that, protecting homosexual, lesbian, and transgender is, again, the most noble and the most difficult thing. Why? Really, among the difficult tasks I asked to my teams, this one is a very specific one. Why? Because, as you may know, when someone applies for asylum, OFPRA, or the Determination Authority, has to make sure about the credibility of what the person says. We have to establish, in this case, the credibility of the sexual orientation. It's crazy. Frankly, it's crazy. But we do it, and we want to do it, and we have to do it because then we protect people who are persecuted in their country, especially in Africa, because of their sexual orientation. But you see how difficult it is. We've been reforming OFPRA very much during those 6 years, on many grounds, and especially on that ground. We've been working very much on the French charities who work with LGBTI people, so that we can do our best, and we still have to do more, to be able to have those interviews about the sexual orientation. It means, for example, that it's completely forbidden for an agent from OFPRA to ask about sexual activities of someone. Forbidden. I don't talk about the kind of thing that some states do about some examination. It's something that's Middle East. We try to build a framework for those examinations which has to be in the full respect for the intimity of the person, but we have to make sure about the credibility of what have been of the sexual orientation, which is something which is our expertise, which is how the people lived in their country, and then we know what happens in each country about that, about the persecutions. I tell you all that because, again, to tell you that it's one of the most noble thing we have and we do. But it's difficult. It means that we can, and we do mistakes. That can happen. But that's something very, very key for us. Because it's the Geneva Convention. As you know, in the Geneva Convention, you have what it's called social group. A social group under the Geneva Convention is a group of people in a country who have common characteristics which make so they are in danger in their country. It can be homosexual in some countries, it can be diverse women in other countries, it can be women who are exploited sexually in other countries, social group. And OFPRA recognized many social groups for homosexual, lesbian, and transgender in many countries. It's a very important but difficult task. And I cannot swear we don't do mistakes. We are going to work on that, still more.
So we'll take another question from our remote audience. So in Cincinnati, they are wondering about your opinion on the effectiveness of the French policy of going to the home countries of the asylum seekers to do refugee resettling, and how that might be different or expanded.
In fact, we don't go to home countries, because home countries are the countries of origin of asylum seekers, so we don't go where persecutions happen. That's other tasks for diplomats. Or we go in transit countries, such as our American colleagues have been doing for years, or Canadian colleagues have been doing for years. We've been doing that for 4 years in Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, Turkey for Syrian asylum seekers. And for more than 1 year in Chad and Niger for African asylum seekers. But for example, in Chad, Chadian people are not eligible to the system, which doesn't mean we protect Chadian people, but when they are in France. We have such system too in Niger. Niger, people from not Nigeria, people from Niger cannot be eligible. I do believe it's very important. Why? For some reasons. First, those are systems, and then they are resettled in France after interviews in those countries. It's very important because it allows people to be protected and come in France or Europe and other countries without having to cross Libya and the Mediterranean Sea. So this is very important. It's above all very important for very vulnerable people. For example, families, families with very ill children, old people, women alone, very vulnerable people. So I do believe it's very, very useful. OFPRA, each month you have OFPRA teams in Niger, in Chad, in Turkey, in Jordan, in Lebanon. But again, it cannot be the only source of protection. If not, you are in externalization, outsourcing. You have to add this. OFPRA is doing that because we are adding. Nobody, if someone arrives in France seeking for asylum, you cannot tell him, oh, I'm sorry, you missed OFPRA in Niger, Chad, or in Jordan, you have to go back there. This would be outsourcing. When the people are arriving in Europe and France, we have, and it's our duty, to take into account their applications. We have to add. So again, I do believe that, and that's what the French president is defending at the European level, develop those systems in transit countries, and building a system which makes so that when someone applies for asylum in Europe, respect asylum.
Another question? Oh, in the cup.
Hi, thank you for coming tonight. You've touched on the economic, political, and a tiny piece of the human rights perspective concerning asylum and refugees in France. But given France's history of colonialism, the Vichy government, and as well as the present segregation that exists in both cities and suburbs, I'm kind of wondering if you can speak a little bit about what it means to accept people who don't look necessarily French, traditionally French, and kind of what that means in accommodating people of different race or class in difference.
I'm not sure to have understood your question, but I will tell you, I'm French. No doubt about that. I'm the little son, petit-fils?
The
Grandson of foreign refugees, as many, many French people. As French, I take French history as a whole. Good and bad periods. Good and bad periods. I don't select, I'm French. I do admit that there are very, very bad periods of our history, such as, I guess, in all countries. And I do assume that, and I know that. And I think we should work more on that. And I'm very proud too of the very nice periods of time of our history. That's the way I work as citizen, as civil servant, as head of OFPRA. Beyond, I'm not sure to have understood your question. What was your question exactly?
I guess I'm wondering if you can speak more towards like if there's a racialized portion of asylum acceptance in France and what that kind of looks like in France. I guess in the US we focus a lot on race, but not necessarily class, and France vice versa.
The fact is that this doesn't exist in France. Racial, I don't know what it is. It's our very Republican way of very French. We don't know that. An asylum seeker is an asylum seeker. He's under the Geneva Convention or not. Whatever his ethnical belonging. The question for us is, does this person have a threat in his country under the Geneva Convention or subsidiary protection, which is a specific part of asylum? But the question of what the person is on any ground, sexual, racial, or anything, it's not our problem. The only question we have as status determination authority is this people, does this person have to be protected under asylum laws? The rest is not our problem. Is that an answer to your question? Yeah, okay. Thank you.
So we have time for one more question, and I'm going to take it from the Alliance Française community in Chicago. And what they're interested in is what needs to be done in France to preserve refugees' own identities from afar, and diversity, and mixing that with integration in France, such that refugees don't become second-class citizens.
That's a very important question. And on this ground, we have different traditions in Europe, and for example, compared to the United States. As you may know, we have a vision in French of what we call integration. The only word says much, which means that we do believe that our community, our national community, shares some values. For example, as you know, that's very French, we have a very specific view of what is the role of religion in the society. That's very French. It's something which doesn't exist in many other countries. It means that we absolutely, completely respect the freedom of religion, but there is a separation very strict between, that's the French Revolution, between the state and the religions. We believe, as many people in the world, that there is equality between men and women. So we obviously believe that when someone lives in France, he shares those values. That's common values. And I do believe that in the process of integration for refugees, I mean for refugees, not asylum seekers, again, it's not my problem as OFPRA, but when someone is refugee, when we are talking about integration, so that people must not be second-class citizens, there is much to do again about training, about employment, about housing, about health, and about sharing those values. Then there is a debate in France, as in many countries, about what it means exactly. Some have a more voluntarist or directive way of living this, others not. But that's the common sense. We have common values, les valeurs de la République. That's the way we call that. And we are very proud of that, because we do believe that it's the best way to live in our diversity. Then, in all countries, there are people who have different views on that, so it will be a long night to discuss about that.
So I think we will end on that note. There's a reception, and so everyone here is invited to go out and eat and drink. And thank you, Monsieur Brice, for coming and talking to us today.